Well, firstly, it's great to be with you from Gladstone Harbour, Kieran. Secondly, this is an industry, in terms of coal specifically, that's employing 300,000 Australians. We've seen Australian banks walk away from the sector for, to be honest, no good reason whatsoever. They've included metallurgical or steel-making coal in the cabal that's not providing finance. I'd be much happier to see Australian banks financing Australian jobs. But I'm also going to stand side by side and shoulder to shoulder with Australia's resources sector, those hardworking men and women whose taxes and royalties pay for all the things that Australians rely on, whether that's schools or hospitals or roads.
The vast majority of mining companies, though, are foreign owned. If you look at the Hunter, an analysis done recently showed that of the 29 coal companies, well over 20 of the 29 are foreign owned. Do we really want to use taxpayer dollars to underwrite foreign owned mining companies?
Well, firstly, we're talking about finance. We're providing support to companies which are legitimate, which are legal, which are providing the service that Australia needs, which are contributing $50 billion in terms of coal and forecast some $350 billion right across the resources sector, without which the country can't pay its bills. And as I said earlier, if Australian banks would line up and provide support for legal businesses, none of these things would be necessary. And what's next? I mean, our financiers, what if they turn out to be teetotalers, Karen? Are they going to then not provide money for pubs and people who have pokie machines? So this is an important industry. We shouldn't be dictated to by foreign entities, whether they are financiers, superannuation funds or other countries. And we'll be standing strongly with the resources sector.
Is this a government policy? Because you're not a backbencher like George Christensen or Matt Canavan. You're the resources minister. Presumably, when ministers speak on issues like this, it's generally policy. Is this government policy?
Karen, no, it is not. However, what it is, as Australia's resources minister, well, I strongly support our sector, and I'm looking to do things which will ensure the sector remains strong into the future. Secondly, we don't have a fixed position on this. This is a discussion. Thirdly, George Christensen and the Trade and Investment Committee have been doing a review for some months on the impact of the withdrawal of insurance and finance into our export markets and export companies and export facilities, and we don't want to export those jobs. I'm looking forward to that report and those recommendations. But there's a fundamental decision to be made here. We want to keep our resources sector, our export sector strong, or we do not. And let's get to the facts. I mean, thermal coal exports, we're just 5% of the world's production. I mean, in China, it's over 2 billion tonnes.
It is unusual, though, for a minister to have an idea like this. I've seen backbenchers come up with, proposals and ideas, whatever else. But for a minister, normally when you're talking about something in your own portfolio space, that generally means it's policy.
Well, Kieran, once again, ministers do have ideas. This is a concept, it's a discussion. It's something I think that needs to be considered, talked about. And once again, if it wasn't for Australia's banks withdrawing support for a very strong part of our economy, legal and legitimate businesses, we wouldn't even be having this discussion.
But is this government really committed to backing resources? I can't remember a time when the resources minister hasn't been in the cabinet. Can you?
Well, once again, I mean, that's not my decision and clearly not a choice I would have made, but it's the position that I'm in. But if we compare these discussions with what we do through the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility, what's happened through the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, ARENA, the RIC, and we've just announced $2 billion towards critical minerals because it'll be an important part in terms of growth for the resources sector. These are challenges which we have right now. I was up in Mackay a couple of weeks ago. If we've got mortgage brokers who can't secure finance for vehicle leases because they work in a met coal mine and steel making coal, well, where are we going? There are 300,000 Australians whose jobs rely on this sector. We need to make sure that legal and legitimate businesses in Australia are supported. And if the Commonwealth needs to be an area of last resort for that support, well, it's something we should talk about and consider.
But shouldn't a government like yours, a coalition government, back the industries where the private sector clearly has a great deal of focus, investment, and that's where things are shifting? If you look, for example, to the coalition government in New South Wales, its renewable energy zone in New England, it was 4 times oversubscribed by private capital, 4 times over what they were after, and yet you're talking about taxpayer dollars to help prop up an industry that is struggling to get funding.
Well, it's not an industry that's struggling to get markets and contracts, and we've got record prices off the back of record demand. If we look at what New South Wales is doing, I think you might want to have a look a bit closer at what other support's being provided, what subsidies there are, when we look at things like the RET and renewable energy certificates. But out in Europe, if you want a comparison, they've put €1 trillion on the table as part of their commitments. That is a significant amount of money. And I don't think we should just walk off into the dark, abandon our resources sector and abandon those coal workers, and we won't be doing that, Kieran. We will not.
But it's not so much about abandoning, because obviously there's a market at the moment and for the foreseeable future. But do you really think that allies, close allies like Japan, Korea, that have committed to net zero by 2050, are they really going to be buying our coal for the next 50 years? Well, out to 2050 at least.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when they talk about abatement, they're talking about sticking in an ammonia pipe or some hydrogen or some gas. Coal will still be one of the dual fuels that are utilised. Australia's got one of the highest quality products in the world. It's got a high calorific content. That's why it'll continue to be in demand. But we've seen idealistic approaches from Australian banks who want to rub out a sector which is legal and legitimate. I think it's wrong. And the way to demonstrate that, they don't separate between thermal coal and metallurgical coal. And if we think that the world's going to go forward without having steel production around the world, well, someone's got it very wrong.
But if it had a positive future, it was going to make money, do you really think that our banks and other investors, insurance companies as well, would be steering clear?
But this is the exact point I've just made. Metallurgical coal very clearly will be needed for decades, as will thermal coal, and yet Australian banks have walked away from both. Now our alternative here is, of course, we'll have foreign investment and foreign finance, and that is likely to come from China. I think we should be looking after our own people. We have only 5% of the world's thermal coal production. We have only just over 1% of the world's emissions. We've reduced our emissions by 20%, better than Japan, better than South Korea, better than the US, better than Canada, better than New Zealand. And yet we will continue to work with technology, and technology will certainly help in this space as well.
But you talk about the Chinese investment. Already the third largest representative in the coal market is Yancoal. Of the 6 largest coal companies, Yancoal has 6% market share. That has a Chinese parent company. And you're today suggesting we have taxpayer dollars help fund the financing of companies like this, foreign-owned companies.
Oh, well, Kieran, we're talking about loans. We're not talking about grants. We're talking about legitimate businesses that have been in place for a long time that will continue to make a profit, that can continue to support their finance packages. But like all businesses, those finance packages come up for review at a period of time, generally about 5 years. And right now they can't source Australian banks for finance for legitimate businesses. Now, as I've said, we will not be walking away from the coal sector. This is an item that's up for discussion. It's a discussion I think we need to have. But it's something which has a direct effect right now. If you look at the insurance position as well, those small mum and dad businesses, those intermediate businesses providing services into both thermal and met coal are getting exactly the same response. You've only got to look at Adani. BMD, big construction company in Queensland, couldn't get insurance to build a railway track because it went to a mine. Now, you can't tell me there's a difference in risk between a railway track that carries cows and one that will carry coal. It's exactly the same.
But if you want to provide that sort of support to foreign-owned companies, why not just buy the companies and keep the profit here? You're talking about a massive fund loan facility for these companies. If you really want to get that sovereign capability, why not just buy the companies?
Well, we're talking about 300,000 Australian jobs, 300,000 Australians in regional Australia who rely on this industry for the... But this is the ability for them to pay their mortgages, pay for their cars, pay for their children's education. They've got good jobs that pay well. They'll have them into the future, but not if we can't secure finance and insurance. It's just a fundamental of business. Without insurance, they'll all close.
Just finally, you mentioned the NAIF board. The only time a project's been rejected was by you when the board proposed an idea. That is the Keban wind farm, creating 250 jobs. Why are those jobs any less important than those jobs you're talking about in the coal sector?
Well, regardless of what the Labor Party might say, let's be really clear. It had no backup. It was intermittent wind only. Our policy is, of course, to continue to deliver on electricity generation which is reliable, which has the capacity to operate at any time. That proposal did not, and I've been proven right, Kieran. They've secured funding from a commercial vendor. The Queensland State Government are the ones that are getting that pushed on, and they didn't need support from the NAIF.
Yeah, well, so the state government had to step in and fund it. They say there is a battery, so it's not intermittent.
No, well, there's absolutely none of that in the proposal that was sent to me. It did not have any sort of backup, including a battery, in the proposal that went to the NAIF. And decisions on that are made based on the applications before me, and not something that might show up on a website afterwards. The Queensland Government is certainly not funding the project. They're basically paying for some maintenance and some upgrades of power lines, which are their responsibility anyway.
Keith Pitt joining me from Gladstone Port. Appreciate your time as always. Thanks so much.
It's great to be with you.